Good evening. Welcome to the Journey Home. I'm Marcus Grodi, your host for this program. I do have this privilege every week of coming into your homes to introduce you to men and women who, by the grace of God, their hearts and minds are open to the beauty of our Lord Jesus Christ and His church. And I also have the privilege sometimes of bringing back guests more than once. And tonight is one of those privileges, one of my favorite guests, actually, though my disappointment is I don't see him very often. So I'd love to discuss more with him even than I can cover here on this short program. But Joseph Pearce, you've seen many times on EWTN, many of his programs. You know him as a writer, as a biographer. I truly believe one of our best biographers today. And I'm not just saying that because Joseph is sitting here. I've never found a book written by Joseph Pearce that I could ever put down. He's a great writer. Joseph Pearce, former agnostic, writer in residence and visiting fellow at Thomas More College in New Hampshire. He's been there just a couple years. One of the reasons we had the excuse of his new book, but before I mention that word, I'm going to welcome Joseph back to the Journey Home.
It's good to be back, Marcus.
It really is. It's neat to have known you these last 20 or so years, to see your own journey and your writing, how it's progressed. It seems like the Lord keeps dropping in your lap timely authors, though, like Tolkien.
Yeah, I mean, I try to just be open to opportunities and to trust that if a door opens, it may be open providentially, and of course you approach the door prayerfully. And honestly, if you'd asked me 20 years ago to write the story of my own life, it would not have been as good as the one that God's written for me. So I feel very, very blessed.
Yeah, I think, and I strongly recommend Joseph's new book, Race with the Devil, My Journey from Racial Hatred to Rational Love. And it's published by St. Benedict Press, former TAN, right?
They own TAN, yeah.
They own TAN, that's what it is. But I don't want to, we're not going to do a book review here. That's for Doug Keck on the Bookmark program. So I encourage all of you to look on the EWTN schedule for when that shows. Talk more about that. But we will talk about some of the themes of the book. But what I do whenever I have a returning guest is to get out of the way as soon as possible and invite you to give the audience a reminder of your journey.
Well, my journey is from hatred to love, in the sense that I joined a white supremacist organization in England back in the 1970s when I was 15 years old. An organization called the National Front that believed, amongst other things, that all non-whites should be forcibly removed from the United Kingdom. I suppose I could have been called a neo-Nazi at that time. I certainly admired Adolf Hitler. I was very involved with the Protestant loyalist terrorist organizations in Northern Ireland, so the Ulster Volunteer Force, the Ulster Defence Association, and also I was a member of the Orange Order, which is an anti-Catholic secret society. So I was very anti-Catholic, very racist, a very long way from Christ and His church. And it's through His grace and through reason. So I met many of these great Catholic writers, such as G.K. Chesterton, Hilaire Belloc, John Henry Newman, eventually St. Thomas Aquinas, but also C.S. Lewis was another major influence upon my conversion. And as I tried to show in the book, another very important aspect was the love shown to me along the path, along the way. And the best antidote to the poison of hatred is love. And really, if we want to convert the world, we just have to grow in love and learn how to love people better and love people more fully, as we're meant to, in a Christ-like way. And certainly the love that I was shown, including by enemies. I give various examples in the book of how certain enemies, that my attitude was, you destroy your enemies. When you're faced with an enemy, and they don't display that attitude, but they display one of a conciliatory charity and love and a desire to do you good, even though you're trying to do them harm, then that really does disarm you. And so I realized the power of love in leading me to love. And there's a great lesson there, that hatred drives people apart, but love does draw people together.
I'm assuming that some of our audience are parents whose children have left the faith. I don't know if very many of them went down the same road that you went. But we do live in a day today where you can't turn on the TV and see that there's some violence happening.
Absolutely, and I think one thing my story does show is that nobody is beyond the reach of God.
Right.
Nobody is beyond the reach of Christ bringing the sinner to the church. Now, whether that's as a convert or a revert, someone being brought back after years away. So there's no one beyond the reach. So there's no need to despair, however far people seem to be. But hatred takes all sorts of forms. Now, there's a bitterness and a bigotry in the culture now. It's full of, the culture we live in now is full of hatred and intolerance. And of course, ironically, intolerance in the name of tolerance, where it's actually now illegal to talk about morality. The words like morality and virtue are excised from the language. We can't talk about sin, that's excised from the language. So we live in almost an Orwellian world where we can't talk about these things that make the world go round. Love is now just about a feeling, normally a selfishly driven feeling. So even the meaning of love has been perverted and polluted. Because of course for a Christian, love is an action. Love is a commandment. Love is about laying down our lives for our friends and our enemies. It's something we have to do, not something we have to feel. So even love itself, the word has been polluted. So we live in a world really of confusion. And in this world of confusion, we see a lot of hatred, a lot of negativity, a lot of bitterness, a lot of suicidal despair, a lot of breakdown in community. I mean, it's not a good place to be. It's not a good place to be because society as a whole has decided ideologically to turn its back on Christ.
I think about the violence that you were a part of, and the rationalization that you blindly bought into, truly believed. It wasn't a skin; it was down to your heart,
Absolutely.
to your conscience.
Absolutely, my conscience too. I believe that what I was doing was right, and this, of course, is the danger of political ideology. That once you leave the orientation towards Christ, once you leave the understanding of that which is good and evil that we learn from the gospel, once you leave that, you can be led by all sorts of demagogues. So yes, I honestly believe in good conscience. It was okay to kill people in order to pursue the good, as I understood the good to be. Right. And the good to be that we need an all-white, monoracial United Kingdom, that all non-whites had to be physically removed. If they don't go willingly, then we have to physically remove them.
You might want to add to that for the audience that this was all a part of that, this Darwinian understanding that we as a human race have risen through this natural selection to a level at which we can now take responsibility for the improvement of our human genome.
Absolutely.
We're irresponsible if we don't do that.
Right, absolutely. And following that Darwinian understanding, I mentioned in the book that Richard Dawkins, the atheist, was a major influence upon me. His book, The Selfish Gene, that basically that of course our genes make us selfish, and if our genes make us selfish, there's nothing wrong with selfishness. And if you can show through physical anthropology, through science, that the white race is the superior race, then of course you have to preserve that race, and that means that inferior races have to be removed. And it's only a short step from that to believe that you can remove them by genocide. And Chesterton in The Man Who Was Thursday shows us that far more people are killed by bad ideas, such as communism and Nazism, or the French Revolution, secular fundamentalism, than are killed by so-called religious wars, which the number of people killed in those are minuscule by comparison, and most of those so-called religious wars were actually fought for secular motives.
I don't want to point fingers at parents. That's not what my next question's at. But we have had a number of guests on the journey home that admit to the fact that when they were brought up in an environment where the parents said, I don't want to influence my child. I want to let them decide for themselves. I mean, I'm not, you draw a very fine picture of your father in your book and your mother. But the issue is, I mean, are you an example of letting a young man decide for himself?
Well, first of all, I think that doing nothing is doing something. It's what the Catholics would call a sin of omission. By doing nothing, you're leaving your children open to a torrent of change in the wrong direction. Of course, part of being a parent is teaching your children right from wrong. And that has to, of course, include the teachings of Jesus Christ. But yeah, one of the most difficult things about my book was getting to grips with my relationship with my father. Now, my father did influence me, but not in terms of religion. It was in terms of, England was the greatest nation that ever lived. My father said, admittedly somewhat jokingly, but nonetheless seriously at the same time, he said there were three types of people in the world. There were Englishmen, those who would like to be Englishmen, and those who don't know any better. It was said sort of jokingly, but he meant it. And the point is, so I grew up believing that being English, I was somehow superior to everybody else. That everybody was either English, or if they weren't, they were envious of the English, or they were too ignorant to know what being English was.
We Americans have never been guilty of that.
Well, actually, no, there were absolute parallels. To be honest with you, I can actually see, the belief that the British brought civilization to the world. There were a certain type of Americans that believe the Americans brought civilization to the world. No, Christ brought civilization to the world, because it's in Christianity that human beings learn to love each other and live with each other. Otherwise, we tear each other apart.
Yeah. As a parent now, this is a kind of a touchy question, but you've been gifted with a child that would have been the kind of child that previously you would have completely justified needed to be put down.
Yeah, we have an 11-year-old son, Leo, who has Down's syndrome and autism. And he's the greatest gift in our lives. Someone said to me once that there are two types of people in the world. There are those who, which is most of us, are here to learn, and there are some of us who are here to teach. And our son Leo is here to teach. He's a great teacher. He's taught my wife and I and our daughter so much. Yes, but in my past, of course, those Untermenschen, those subhumans were, of course, not only would it be permissible to abort children with Downs, it would have been your responsibility to enhance the gene pool of the race, to keep such inferior types from entering the world. So yeah, I've come a long way by the grace of God, and of course now Leo is a great gift, because I come to realise it's through people like Leo that we learn to love. Yeah. And ultimately, growing up is very simple. Growing up is about learning to love better and more fully as you get older. And having children with disabilities is one of the best ways we can learn to love, and therefore one of the greatest gifts that we can be given.
Well, it's almost as if the Lord allowed you to have that life so you could truly appreciate the gift He was one day going to give you.
Yeah, absolutely. Certainly once one has experienced the darkness, and certainly my youth was one of great darkness. I went to prison twice as well. It's obviously mentioned in the book. For publishing material likely to incite racial hatred. So I spent my 21st birthday in prison, my 25th birthday in prison. So yeah, I've experienced the darkness. And Hilaire Belloc said about the Catholic Church, he said, outside is the night and strange things in the night. And I think that once you've actually lived in the night, you've seen the darkness, you've seen the strange things that are out there, then once by the grace of God you find yourself on the inside, you realise how blessed you are, how saved you are from that darkness. And of course there's darkness in everybody's heart. You don't exercise sin. The race with the devil, that my book title is The Race with the Devil. Well, the race with the devil is not over until you die. So the race with the devil is still being run. But the point is, by the grace of God and with the help of His sacraments and being inside the church, when I'm outside in the dark, I'm much more able, by the grace of God, to win that race.
Once again, our guest in the program tonight is Joseph Pearce. Often in the journey home, we seem to focus most on why a person became Catholic, or they discovered the beauties of the Catholic Church. And of course, I'd love to. We've talked about that in previous programs. Your journey, race with the devil. Talk about, step by step, your journey with Jesus, coming to understand Him.
Yeah, again, there's something about, I was an agnostic, I was full of bitterness and hatred, and yet, Christmas carols moved me. I can, these little grains of love that are in us from the culture, which of course the secular fundamentalists are trying to remove. We can't even mention Christmas at Christmas these days. But I loved the idea of Jesus on one level. I loved the idea of this good man who did good things. And of course, and I saw adaptation of A Christmas Carol and eventually read A Christmas Carol. Charles Dickens is wonderful. And of course I rejoiced at Scrooge's conversion. In other words, these are seeds of goodness, but the seeds of goodness in a desert of hatred.
Yeah. And also I'm wondering, I don't mean to interrupt you, but even I remember in your story that as you were being drawn to G.K. Chesterton, drawn to things of the church, at the same time you were fully involved with all that other stuff.
Yes.
So I'm wondering, even in your discovering of what you saw good in Jesus, it was still through the eyeglasses of this whole other ideology.
I was a miserable sinner, full of hatred and bitterness, and yet Jesus was still reaching me. I mean, the analogy I sometimes use, or the metaphor, is it's an arm wrestle in my heart and my head, for the battle, the reason. I always thought that the idea that all of this was here by some cosmic accident, or of course not a cosmic accident, but a series of 1,000,000 to 1 cosmic accidents. In fact, millions of accidents or 1,000,000 to 1 chances. Completely unbelievable. And really the atheist is forced to admit that, that it's a several trillion to 1 chance, but that's fine. It happened, right? Well,
a miracle of that.
It's in fact, yeah, exactly. And indeed, but even then, that whole several trillion to 1 sequence doesn't answer how does nothing become something. They have to fall back on mysticism, such as it was always been something. What does that mean? It just seems to require. So from the earliest days, I thought there had to be a God. So there's the rational approach, but of course God's not necessarily Christ, and I for a long time could sort of put the issue to one side, but Christ has always been attractive to me. Even when in the midst of my hatred, Christ was always attractive, because Christ is attractive, and I think if anybody genuinely hates Christ, they basically Gollumize themselves. They become like Gollum in the Lord of the Rings, that their soul has become so shriveled that they no longer even like the good, the true, and the beautiful. If you showed them a sunrise, they would want to hide from it, as Gollum does. The light itself is an enemy. If you get that far, you're in big trouble. And thankfully, in spite of all my hatred and bitterness, I think there was a remnant of gratitude in my heart for the good and true and beautiful things in life. I did admire. I talk in the book about the first time I saw starlight in the countryside in England, because I was brought up in London. So you have, if you like, the beauty of God being obscured by the artificial virtual reality of light pollution. And there's a metaphor there, all the stuff that we have in the modern world can actually get in the way of the things that really matter. Then the first time I find myself in the countryside, the stars, and there were so many of them. I never knew there were so many stars, and the beauty of it. And it reminds me now, although I didn't know this then, of Oscar Wilde's famous statement that we're all in the gutter, but some of us are looking at the stars. And I think that's the point, that of course we're all miserable sinners, but do we love beauty? Do we love goodness? Do we love truth? Or do we think that the gutter is all there is? In other words, are we happy to be face down in the gutter, wallowing in it? Or do we see there's something beyond the gutter that is better than it? And I do think that even in my darkest days, I saw that there was something beyond the gutter. And that was, if you like, the line by which God slowly tugged me out of it. Not that I'm free of sin, of course.
Yeah, that image that you used in there, you also, about the seeing the stars, you also described there how you and your friend were walking a mile through the darkness to a pub.
Right.
Okay. And so you saw the stars for the first time, but you couldn't imagine walking through this darkness because you couldn't see a thing. But in time, you began to be able to see it.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking of that was an analogy of that it takes a while for us, when we're blinded by the artificiality of it, for our normal spirituality to start seeing again.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the metaphor. I'd only ever really seen by artificial light, which means I was blind, ironically. So when you put me out where the light we have is starlight, the natural light that comes from God, at first I was dazzled by the darkness. I mean, paradoxically, that I couldn't see it. How can we possibly walk a mile in this? I can't see 10 yards in front of me. But of course your eyes do adjust, the starlight does become, and then you see the outline of hedges and it becomes beautiful. And of course we can walk to the pub, it's not a problem. Of course we can walk home again. In other words, you don't need all those artificial constructs. You don't need all of those crutches that God himself in his own beauty provides what we need to see by, provides our eyes and the light which we use. We don't need the other stuff. The other stuff often as not gets in the way and obscures our view. It does not allow us to see. It prevents us from seeing.
I also believe that one of the reasons the Lord allows us to experience life outside the family is so that when we are home, we can bring with us what we've learned from it to help us understand problems we see in the world. Even as we're talking, you can't turn on the news without seeing a seemingly rise in violence in a culture. Almost a day doesn't go by when we don't hear of another person doing a murder-suicide. You know, they're young, seemingly innocent young people that no one around them guessed. But then the next minute they walk into a school covered with bombs and whatever and just kill randomly. And we're seeing this kind of random violence. I mean, another thing that we're taking for granted, the thing we call a computer virus, as if it's a disease. No, a computer virus is something that a person spreads around to cause havoc in people's lives. You were a person of violence. Talk to us about what's going on.
Well, I mean, I certainly believe that if you wanted to bring a new order, you had to destroy the present one. So I went to prison twice for publishing material likely to incite racial hatred because I wanted to incite racial hatred. I wanted there to be a race war. I wanted that the races not to be able to live together in harmony, but to cut each other's throats. And so there are certainly parallels here with the Islamic fundamentalists that we see today. But also, you know, but I think even in some ways even more sad than that, because this is the ideology that leads to hatred. But what we have now is a nihilism, where people have a radical individualism, and a radical individualism means you're alone. You're alone in a world where we've basically been told there is no meaning. If there's no meaning, there's no moral. And if there's no moral and no meaning, then you're alone in the world, angry and vacuous, which is why if you go around, I might go to the gym, and everybody's plugged in. You know, everyone's listening, everyone's texting. It's as if we have to distract ourselves and spend our whole life distracted. Because the moment that we are by ourselves with a moment of silence, we realize what the vacuum is we're living in. It's nothing but a vacuous, nullified, meaningless existence. Because that's what radical relativism is. And of course, then, so we have this moment of silence, then we do something crazy, like these kids that are going out killing people at random, or violence at random, sex abuse. All of this stuff is because we're living in a vacuum, because we've actually sucked meaning, sucked morality, sucked the order out of the cosmos, and left ourselves with nothing. So distraction is the only thing that keeps us sane.
Yeah. I mean, it's not just people committing suicide. It's people going to take 2 or 3 with them first and then.
Right.
And again, they don't see anything on the other side of death. There's not even a sense in which they're going to do this. I'm going to pay these people back. They're not going to have a chance to wallow in their revenge because they're killing themselves. Right. I mean, it just does not make sense.
No, it doesn't. I mean, it's the theologian or the philosopher would call it despair. It's the absence of hope. You know, and when you're in that hopeless situation, you just lash out. Now, because it's a human need. And instead of the human need being embracing people in community, in love, which is what we're supposed to do, you hate people. I'm going to go down, but I'm going to take people with me. You know, I hate, it's hate thy neighbor instead of love thy neighbor.
I mean, even the violent group that you were part of had a rationale behind it, even though it was bent. As C.S. Lewis would have described it was bent. But this violence, which seems to be a rise, is a lack of ultimate meaning. Do you see this could get off on a whole other tangent, but it's something you and I both share, and that's the influence of the industrial culture that we live in. Do you see that soup of industrialism that our America and the world is in influencing some of these ideas?
Absolutely. We've lived for the last 200 or more years in a very materialistic culture. not just materialism in the sense of there being no God, but materialism in the sense of that basically, that the more things you have, the happier you'll be. That rather crass nihilistic statement that he who dies with the most toys wins, which is of course nonsense. He who dies with the most toys dies. They can't take the toys with them, and what happens afterwards is the big question. But it's true that we live in a culture that's possessed by its possessions. We are possessed by our possessions. Some of the great works of literature, such as The Lord of the Rings, it's all about how do we overcome this possession. And unless we become detached from this materialistic culture, we are enslaved to it because we think things will make us happy. And we live in a culture, the very system is such. The politicians are only interested in getting re-elected. So they don't care about planning for 10 years ahead. They want to be popular next year when the election comes around. Company directors have got to keep the shareholders happy. So they don't care about what's happening 10 years from now. The actual accounts for the company at the end of this year have to be good so that the shareholders get their dividends. So there's a built-in, if you like, systematic myopia, short-sightedness in the system. So there's no way of seeing ourselves as part of a continuum, seeing ourselves as part of a purpose, thinking about the world 30 or 40 years now for our children to inherit. There's none of that. And of course, part of the consequence of that living myopically is also the absence of children. So we have an aging population that refuses to have children, that refuses to embrace the future. Well, that is a recipe for collapse and for disaster.
Yeah, that has bought into a goal that they believe is what everyone should strive for, of a level of affluence that is totally unsustainable in our world.
It's unsustainable, and also even when for the minority that are happy enough to get it does not bring happiness. If one thing we have learned surely is that what sums up this materialism is Mick Jagger's words. I can't get no satisfaction. Because the word satisfaction from the Latin satis means enough. Well, a culture that tells you you're going to be happy if you have more is never going to have enough, and therefore it's never going to be satisfied.
All right, well, let's take a break, Joseph, and we'll come back with some more reflections on your own journey. And about what I'd like to ask you as soon as we come back is what was the thing about the Catholic Church that made you Catholic as opposed to the other options that were out there? All right, we'll go with that when we come back. Welcome back to The Journey Home. I'm Marcus Grodi, your host, and I am blessed on this program to have a good friend, Joseph Pearce, who's remind the audience of a couple. You've done a Shakespeare program for EWTN.
Yeah, I did 2 13-part series called The Quest for Shakespeare for EWTN, and I've done 3 hour-long specials on The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit for EWTN.
All right. And all of his biographies I highly recommend. I can't think of one that I wouldn't recommend, Joseph. And, God's given you a nice gift that you've used. It's both and, right? God gives us gifts, but we still got to use them and respond to them.
Absolutely.
You could have gone in a lot of directions. Why Catholic? I mean, what was there about the Catholic?
Well, ultimately, there's, of course, looking back on it, there's a mystical intervention on the part of Christ in leading me to his church. I was very anti-Catholic, as I've said, right. Very negative towards the Catholic Church, but I was interested in politics, as you would have gathered. We used to have violent demonstrations with the extreme left, with the communists, on the streets of London and elsewhere. And apart from punching and kicking and throwing of bricks, they would also they would say to us, "You are just the stormtroopers of capitalism." And my attitude was, that I may not like communism, but that doesn't mean I want the world run by multinational corporations or by Bill Gates or whoever the 1980s equivalent of Bill Gates was. So therefore I was looking for alternatives. And then someone said, by the grace of God, Have you looked at the political ideas of G.K. Chesterton and Hilaire Belloc? Now, I wasn't interested in their religion. In fact, I was very antagonistic towards their Catholicism. But I was interested in politics, and I did read their political ideas and very much agree with them. I found myself converted to that way of seeing things. But I also just fell in love with Chesterton. I fell in love with his personality, with his sense of humour, with his humility. I mean, the connection between humour and humility and gratitude and humility, I fell in love with. And of course, I came to see, because everything you read of Chesterton's ultimately goes back to Christ. Everything that Chesterton writes leads back to Christ. I came to see that all that I found attractive in Chesterton was Jesus Christ. And so Chesterton led me to want to desire Christ, and of course Chesterton was a convert to Catholicism. Chesterton shows that the path to the church is one of reason, and that's very important, the connection between faith and reason, but also ultimately it's an expression of love, and Chesterton shows that love and shows that reason, and love and reason is a very, very powerful combination. And so through Chesterton and Hilaire Belloc, I came to these other great writers, John Henry Newman, and C.S. Lewis, not a Catholic, but a great thinker leading people to Jesus Christ and, I would say, his church. I read a book called C.S. Lewis and the Catholic Church, which looks at the relationship between Lewis and the church. He was a man that, for me, was leading towards the church himself and certainly led many other people, myself included, to the church.
In my own journey, when I was a Protestant, I was subtly anti-Catholic. And many think that once you become Catholic, then normally that you're the flip side. But would you say also, as I've come to discover, that one of the beauties of my Catholic faith is a love for my separated brethren?
Absolutely. Now, but what I would say, the race with the devil is one that continues, and you continue to grow. Certainly, when I came to an understanding of Catholicism, I thought, well, Protestantism was wrong. Right, and it was very simple at that stage. Now, of course, I come to see that that basically, as long genuine Protestants are facing Christ and moving towards Christ, and what the Catholic Church is the fullness of that union with Christ this side of the grave, and indeed the other side of the grave. I mean, one of the things that really, really got me about Catholicism was its ecclesiology. I read a book called The Spirit of Catholicism by Carl Adam. Yeah. When it came to me, wow, the Catholic Church is the mystical body of Jesus Christ. And why is that? Because the church is the church triumphant, the church in heaven, the church suffering, the church in purgatory, and the church militant, the church on earth. And the realization of where we are here is just one part, and in fact the smallest part of this cosmological church was crucial to me. So in that sense, that the church is a fulfillment, it's the mystical body of Jesus Christ, fulfillment of all desire for Christ. So now, absolutely, and especially in this secular fundamentalist culture, where Christ is being persecuted and his followers are being persecuted, regardless of where they are in the religious divide. And I actually do think that one of the good things that's going to come out of this secular fundamentalist persecution is the Christians coming together in a way that, for all the discussions, all the ecumenism in the past never succeeded. Persecution will bring us together, and that has to be a great blessing.
I really believe that one of the reasons the Holy Spirit called John the 23rd for the council, and the wisdom that was behind the council, was what so many of these men had experienced in the war, as they became to see the work of the Holy Spirit in non-Catholic brothers and sisters. And they saw this need for this openness in a way that maybe they had never seen before. And I think that's exactly what you're saying. C.S. Lewis talks about it in The Four Loves. I mean, friends don't sit and look at each other and rip. They're standing side by side, fighting a common enemy.
Right.
Or a common love, or whatever it is. They're drawn together.
Right.
And
I think this is the hand of providence, when you see the hand of providence spread over the centuries, because the Council of Trent, of course, was called because of the rupture that was being caused at the time, and to reaffirm those things about the Catholic Church which needed reaffirming because they were being cast into doubt. So the Council of Trent, if you like, is called the Counter-Reformation Council. In actual fact, it was a Catholic Reformation. It was a renewal of the Church to establish what the Church is at a time when there was lots of doubts about what the Church is. Well, in the 20th century, with the Second Vatican Council, at this time we're now living in a world of secularism. Secularism is in the rise, so the issues of the Reformation are, if you like, subsiding into the background. And people from Pope Leo XIII onward, with Rerum Novarum, was addressing this new rise of secularism, whether it be socialism on the one hand and the atheism that goes with that, or the sort of radical materialism of the worst sort of capitalism on the other hand. So secularism was the enemy now, and I think that did allow us to a rapprochement with our separated brothers and sisters in other Christian denominations, that we are together as witnesses of Christ in a world which is turning away from him.
You're known as a man of literature, writer and teacher, and I'd like you to talk a bit about the power of literature to help young people particularly get drawn to Jesus and his church.
Well, it's crucial. It's crucial particularly in this day and age because we live in a radical relativism, and a radical relativism denies reason, and it also denies love because it makes love narcissistic. It's about me, and of course love cannot be about me. Love has to be about the other, otherwise it's not love, laying down your life for the other. So in an age which has basically perverted and polluted the understanding of love, so it becomes narcissistic and about feeling, and an age which has become so individualistically relativist that it doesn't talk about reason as being something objective. Beauty is the means by which you bring people to the goodness and the truth of reality. So the example I give is if you stand a Catholic, a Protestant, a Jew, and an atheist in a field facing east. It sounds like it's the beginning of a joke.
It could be.
It could be. But they see a sunrise. They see the sunrise, and maybe when it rises, it's white, and they can look at it, it turns red, and then eventually turns gold, and they have to look away. Unless they are Golemized, unless they are so dead to beauty, they're all going to be grateful for the experience of seeing that beautiful thing. And once you have a feeling of gratitude, the next question you ask is, well, whom shall I thank? So it sets you off asking the right questions. So beautiful literature and beautiful art does this. If we walk into St. Peter's, our hearts, unless we're dead, our hearts and minds are lifted up to God. That's the purpose of the magnificence of the building. The great work of literature does the same thing. So I'll give you maybe just one example, because we could give many. The Lord of the Rings. The Lord of the Rings, everybody who reads The Lord of the Rings, which is, as Tolkien himself said, and these are Tolkien's words, The Lord of the Rings is, of course, a fundamentally religious and Catholic work. So everybody who reads The Lord of the Rings, whether they're an atheist, whether they're Protestant, whether they're a Jew, whether they're a Catholic, are going to be moved closer to the truth. Closer to the truth which is fulfilled in Christ and his church. But of course, if you're over here and you're an atheist, you're not going to be moved by reading The Lord of the Rings in one fell swoop to a full embrace of Catholicism. I'm sure it has happened, but it would be unusual. But what you would be is nudged closer. You'd be nudged closer if you're an atheist to a belief in an ordered world with therefore an orderer, with a God of a cosmos. So this is just one example. So literature in an age that has turned its back on reason, an age that's turned its back on love, shows us through the power of beauty the goodness and truth that ultimately leads to God.
You've written biographies of authors. Is one of the reasons that you do that is because, again, talking to parents wanting to encourage literature, is that sometimes it's important to know the author so you understand what he's written. I mean, to me, an example of that is I could have a book here, War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells, and I could have a book here, what's one of Flannery O'Connor's titles, The Life You Saved, maybe your own or whatever that. It's important for us to know the authors to interpret the work correctly.
Absolutely. The trouble is that if we can't see a work through the eyes of the author, we are going to see it through our own prejudice perception, which is what relativists do with the cosmos. Right? There is no truth beyond us, so therefore we make up our own mind about it. Well, reading a text that way is the same thing. We're probably going to misread it. We're not going to see what's really there. So if you can understand where the author's coming from, because ultimately a work of literature is going to be an expression of the personhood of the author. And the deepest elements of someone's personhood, of course, are their deepest held beliefs, their theology, their philosophy, the times in which they live. So the more you understand that, the more you will be able to read the work through their eyes. And what you're doing, of course, with a great author, you're growing. I mean, if you just read a work yourself, it's not going to be bigger than you are, because you're just projecting into it your own pride and prejudice, and having brought back to you narcissistically your own pride and prejudice. Where if you, in humility, see a work through the eyes of the author, you're seeing the world as that author sees it. You're growing in experience, you're growing in knowledge, you're growing in wisdom. Great literature is like a cathedral. It allows us to grow in the space that it provides.
Yeah, I think your work with Shakespeare, which is, again, I recommend to everyone, is another example where not only have people thrown their own ideology into the works of the author, but then they recreate the author to back up what they want his works to say.
Exactly. Yeah, it literally is our Frankenstein monster. You basically make Shakespeare be what you want him to be. You make his plays be what you want them to be. Whereas, Shakespeare, as can be shown through the facts of his life, was a believing Catholic at a time when the Catholic Church was being persecuted, where priests were being put to death and tortured just for being priests. Now, if Shakespeare's a Catholic writing in those times, that's going to be reflected in his work. And if you don't see it through those eyes and through the eyes and perspective of that time, you're going to miss this depth of beauty. And it's always profoundly Catholic, always profoundly Christian, but also very angry at times. I mean, in that scenario, we're not surprised that Shakespeare writes plays like Macbeth and Othello and King Lear, because these are very dark times. And of course, we seem to be moving towards dark times now. So Shakespeare, in many ways, is as relevant now as he was when he wrote the plays 400 years ago.
Another author that influenced both you and me in our journeys was Schumacher, E.F. Schumacher, in a different way. And to me, there's another example of an author whose work can be adopted and adapted by a culture without knowing the author, right, or the thinking behind him. Schumacher was a convert to the Catholic Church, and maybe explain to the audience maybe how Schumacher affected your own journey even to this day, because you ended up writing a review of one of his books, Small is Still Beautiful. Right. It was your book as an updated book of his, Small is Beautiful.
Yeah, E.F. Schumacher was a German economist who came to England in the 1930s to escape Hitler and the Nazi regime. He was a Marxist for a while, and then he came to realize that basically economics was not a standalone science, but was a derivative of religion. That if you actually change the philosophical or theological starting point, where you start from, the economics changes. And so this was a radical sort of wake-up call for him. He's a very, very influential economist. So they wrote a book called Small is Beautiful, Economics as If People Mattered. And it was profoundly influential, sold millions of copies. In many ways can be seen as laying the foundations for the modern sort of green movement, the environmental movement.
Mother Earth, all that ideology.
All that ideology, which is now sort of sometimes moving in the direction of the New Age and neo-paganism. And the irony there is, of course, as you rightly said, is that Schumacher's vision for the economy and for the world was based upon his reading of papal encyclicals, particularly of Leo XIII and Pius XI, his understanding of the fact that you cannot have a healthy economy without healthy morality. So eventually he bases all healthy economics on the cardinal virtues, and without virtue, you cannot have an economy or a society that's going to work. And so these ideas, which were profoundly influential on what is now the New Age movement, are actually profoundly Catholic ideas. And if those people could see the work as Schumacher saw the work, they would not only be enlightened, they'd actually be closer to sorting out problems. If you like, these people are right about what's wrong, but they're now wrong about what's right. Yeah. And if they understood Schumacher, they would understand everything as they should.
I think another example of that is Dorothy Day's work with the poor, that, as you've said, it's all about love in the end. The great Burt Bacharach in his song, What the World Needs Now is Love, Sweet Love. Okay, that comes out of the 60s. But if you don't have a true understanding of what love is, then the output of what you're going to do with that love can be bizarre.
Yeah.
Even Dorothy Day was deeply committed to her faith, deeply committed to Jesus, living it out. And so the reason, as with Mother Teresa, love was guided by faith. Yeah. And I see that in your book. The reason you're here is because God used love through people.
Absolutely.
to bring
and there's
them
no
home.
separation, can be no separation between love and the cross. So the whole idea that you can have love without suffering, is bizarre and perverse and ultimately false, because if you try to have love without suffering, you're not having love, and you still get suffering. You actually you lose on both counts, because you make suffering worse by failing to give lovingly to your neighbor and your enemy and everybody else. So you actually heap more suffering upon yourself. So you get the cross anyway. In other words, the cross is unavoidable, but love and suffering are inseparable. And so to have a sort of a New Age, for instance, system, or the materialistic system that you make yourself more comfortable and you will be happier. Well, it is not true. That comfort in itself does not bring happiness. The embrace of suffering, the acceptance of suffering, ultimately the joy that comes from suffering, brings a deeper happiness that's absolutely unattainable without it. So love and suffering go hand in hand. And that, of course, must mean embracing the suffering of our fellow human beings and helping our fellow human beings and laying down our lives for our fellow human beings in caritas, in true love. And without that, if it's all about selfishness, it's all about me, in individualism in its various forms, whether it's, hedonistic capitalism or New Age, egocentrism, it's about self-help. You can only help yourself by helping others. There's no escaping that.
Yeah. And again, literature, the story of Scrooge in the Christmas Carol, we always think it's a Christmas story. Well, it kind of is, of course, but it's really about Scrooge recognizing what true love is all about.
Absolutely, and he has to understand by being shown supernaturally, by these ghosts of Christmas past, present, and future, all the blessings that he's been given in his past, that he's turned his back on, that he's been blind to because of his arrogance, because of his pride, because of his bitterness, and it all comes back down to gratitude. Gratitude and humility are synonymous. They're the same thing. If we're grateful for the blessings in our lives, we'll have humility. If we have humility, everything else comes from that. If we're ungrateful and we're blind and bigoted and bitter and self-centered, as Scrooge was, our lives become completely miserable. He has no love because he won't give any love. And of course, there are still people that love him, his relatives, in spite of everything. And in fact, it's the realization of that, of course, that makes him realize what a blessed person he is. And being open to those blessings, being grateful for those blessings, is the source and cause of his conversion.
Yeah, and that one scene in the book, as well as all the different movie adaptations, of all this hoarding of everything, but in the end, it was seeing his name on a tombstone, the fear of death. He had to let go of all of that, even letting go of the fear of death, to give everything away to everyone else. Well, that's what we're called to. Isn't that what Pope Francis is calling us to?
Yeah, I mean, basically, all great literature, great art throughout the history of the centuries, the memento mori, the reminder of death. And the reminder of death is always to remind us of the four last things: death, judgment, heaven, and hell. And one of the reasons everyone's plugged in and distracted these days is that the moment they have time to think, death looms its ugly head. And what does that mean, looms its ugly head? And in a healthier society, it means death, judgment, heaven, and hell. And being aware of that, having that memento, that reminder with us at all times, which of course the crucifix is. The crucifix is that memento mori par excellence. Having that with us enables us to keep ourselves oriented, basically heading towards the true north, which is Jesus Christ.
It could sound like, with all of our discussion, that's all intellectual, maybe all interior spiritual. Talk about the place of sacraments in your journey, the incarnational aspect of the sacramental graces.
Well, G.K. Chesterton said, when asked why he became a Catholic, so I could have my sins forgiven. And there is something about the Catholic, the incarnational dimension of the Catholic religion, that we do believe, because Christ established these sacraments, that our sins are forgiven if we confess them with contrition to a priest acting in persona Christi. Our sins are forgiven. So when we get dirty and filthy, and of course this has it's not just cosmetic. As we get dirty and filthy through sin, it has a very bad effect on our health, spiritually and physically, because one has repercussions of the other. Then we can be cleansed and purged and set back on the right path. Our sins are forgiven. And of course, Jesus Christ feeds us himself in the Blessed Sacrament with the bread of life. And again, in the words of the gospel, there's no doubt about it, that what he's doing is what he's doing. This is my body, not this is a metaphor. This is my body. Jesus Christ feeds us. So he cleans us, he washes us, sets us back on the straight and narrow, and feeds us for the journey. And of course I could go on about the other sacraments, but this for me is the mystical body of Jesus Christ. The church is the mystical body of Jesus Christ, which we are engrafted into. We are in communion with, insofar as we wish to be, insofar as we submit ourselves in love to Christ. He's the bridegroom, we're the bride, and then we have that indissoluble union, the one flesh, and we can become one flesh with Jesus. And ultimately, that's of course in heaven, in the perfection, but we can begin that process in the spiritual life here by being in communion with that one flesh in the Eucharist.
Let's say that we've got a parent listening right now to you that's got a kid just like you were, daughter just like you were, or there's someone that's got a friend that's just like you were. What do we do?
Love.
How do we reach out?
Love. I come back in my book that there's the moments of love, particularly when my enemies whom I hated loved me. That's the most disarming thing possible. What we have to try to avoid doing, and I know this is easier said than done, I speak from experience, is become angry and argumentative and close our hearts because this person's doing stupid things, saying stupid things, is moving in the wrong direction, is going to have disastrous consequences on themselves and on others. You're not going to force them back. You can't force someone back to Jesus Christ. You can only love someone back to Jesus Christ. And so that's the only thing I would say, love.
But some of the ways that love was shared with you, for example, was the giving of a book.
Yes, absolutely.
The gift of a rosary.
Yep.
I mean, I think about that moment in your life that person gave you that rosary.
Yeah. I mean, I was very antagonistic towards rosary beads, and I was given them at just a time when I needed to pray, and I'd never prayed before in my life. So that was, again, providential. These things happen at the right time. So, but again, we can't force it. I mean, in other words, we're not God. We don't control providence. So we have to love, and yes, we have to use prudence and prayer to know when to do what we should do, when to say something, when not to say something, when to give something, when not to give something. So it's about prudence and prayer, but always animated by love.
I feel bad that we only have a couple minutes left because one person we didn't talk about is your other half.
My wonderful wife, you mean?
And family.
Yes.
But talk about her, though, in terms of the journey. At what place has this wife helped continue this journey?
Well, I met her after I became a Catholic. I think, to be fair to her, she would not have contemplated marrying me 10 years earlier. I needed her, and I needed marriage, and I needed family, I needed children. And I think that the beautiful thing about marriage and children is it helps us grow up. We don't really fully become grown-ups until we have, a wife or a spouse and children. They teach us to be responsible. They teach us to love, because marriage and parenthood does not work without self-sacrificial giving. So my wife and my children have been absolutely indispensable in my ongoing, and the race with the devil is an ongoing one. Growing in love for Jesus and for his church is helped greatly by the incarnational aspect of that one flesh you see in marriage and children.
One other question then. In terms of liturgical prayer, the reason I ask this as a person of literature, that there's a power of the prayers that we've been given. It doesn't squelch freedom or originality. It in fact opens us to the grace of God.
Absolutely.
Talk about that, because I know as a person of literature, the power that it communicates of grace.
Well, as regards to my own prayer life, the first thing that we always do is have evening meal, prayers obviously before it, prayers during it, particularly at certain liturgical seasons, and then we have our evening prayer before we put everyone to bed, and then that's part of the routine of the family. It's so we have it prayer centered. Personally, I love prayer such as the Angelus. I think everything we need to know about our relationship with God, our relationship with creativity, my own relationship as a writer, is the angel of the Lord declared unto Mary, the gift is offered. Behold the handmaid of the Lord. I accept the gift. So it's an act of my will embracing a gift given, and the word is made flesh. And it's through that relationship between the giving of grace and the acceptance of grace through the will that leads to the fruits of grace in action. And so that that one short prayer, which we're supposed to say every morning, every noon, every night, I think we have the whole mystery of the cosmos like an acorn contained within it.
All right. Let's say they want to find out more about you. Where should they go? Is it an internet site or?
I edit the St. Austin Review, so staustinreview.com.
Okay.
Or they can go to any of my publishers for my books, or any good Catholic bookstore for my books.
All right, as well as EWTN. I'm sure they can get all your stuff.
EWTN Religious Catalogue, absolutely.
Joseph, thank you so much.
Thank you. God bless.
It's always good to have you on the program, and thank you for being obedient and open to our Lord Jesus to be a vessel of his love and grace to others. Thank you for doing that, Joseph. And thank you for joining us on this program. I hope it's been an encouragement to your own journey of faith. God bless you. See you.